talk about the diaspora of the Dominican Republic, and also, can people vote here for the Dominican Republic elections?
So yes, people can vote here for the Dominican Republic elections. Sometimes, there's this sort of nickname that we have specifically for the community in New York, and that's Provincia 33, right? So sort of like the 33rd province of Dominican Republic. And, I think even for me being part of the diaspora, we care so much about what's happening in the country because a lot of the issues that happen in Dominican Republic and a lot of the conditions of the people there actually lead to there being such a widespread diaspora. I mean, we're talking about Dominicans being not only in New York City, not only in different parts of, the United States, but there's a large population of Dominicans in Spain. There's Dominicans all across the globe. And I think these protests have become an opportunity for people to almost come out and say, hey, we're Dominicans and we're also living in the exterior and we would love to live in our country, but it's difficult to live there because of these very issues that are happening, And earlier you asked me about the PLD, right? So people are saying that there was attempts at fraud. So whenever people went to the ballot and they tried to vote for their candidate of preference, some of the candidates were not showing up in the ballot, and this is very, very questionable. It's very shady, to say the least. And people see this as an attempt at sabotage. This is the first time in 18 years, or the first time at least in a decade, when the PLD is no longer ahead in the polls, when instead is the opposition party, which is also questionable, is ahead in the polls, right? So this is the first time when the PLD might not win the elections, and they found themselves in a situation of fear. And instead of, allowing for the democratic process to happen, people see this as an attempt at sabotaging that democratic process.
I wanted to ask you about the attempt to redo the election. This time, they're going to paper ballots because the problem, apparently, they claim, was that this was an electronic voting system that somehow malfunctioned. As if we haven't heard this story before. Did we just hear about Iowa? Haven't we heard about all these other problems with electronic voting? So now they're going back to the old-fashioned paper ballot. And then they have a presidential election in May, isn't there?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So these elections were not only, meant for people to choose their local leaders. And we know how important it is, to choose the mayor that represents you, to choose the regional leader that represents you. But these ballots were also going to create momentum, or were an opportunity to create momentum for the opposition come the presidential elections. Now that momentum has been lost, because there is no credibility in the election process, and we have no idea what's going to happen March 15. Also, they spent $19 million on these voting machines, and people are angry about that. A lot of the signs that I have seen in protests, they say these dollars, they went to the trash. How can you spend $19 million and all of that, and the machines don't work? Like,
There's been no connection between Dominican Republic and Iowa that's been uncovered, has there?
Not that we know of, but I wouldn't be surprised.
But also, Amanda, you talk about this, and Juan, you write about this in Harvest of Empire. Talk about the history of the Dominican Republic and U.S. relations there, with U.S. soldiers moving into the Dominican Republic, invading the Dominican Republic in 1965, and how that shapes modern-day Dominican Republic.
Yeah, so, there were memes popping up during on Sunday of the face of Joaquín Balaguer. And the meme was basically him laughing and saying, wow, you don't even know how to properly steal an election. So Joaquín Balaguer was the man that the United States helped put in power once there was a U.S.-backed coup in 1965. And he was president. I like to talk about this a lot because I feel that Dominican Republic I feel that people normally look at Trujillo, right? The Trujillo dictatorship that lasted 30 years. That was like a very, very tough stronghold regime where a lot of people were killed, a lot of people were disappeared. And they think, okay, after Trujillo happened, we had democracy. That's it. And that wasn't the case. Balaguer was president starting from the late 1960s up until the early 1990s. We're talking about like 2 to 3 generations of Dominicans who saw Balaguer on and off in power. And his was also a right-wing, sort of strong regime and a repressive regime. And people are already seeing the connection, between his time in presidency and also how long the PLD has been in power and how they have crushed the opposition. And talking about, U.S. interventions, there was an article in the Washington Post that came out where Giuliani, we're talking about President Donald Trump's attorney, was in the Dominican Republic consulting for Luis Abinader, who is the opposition leader. So already the other opposition parties are saying, well, this guy is trying to get U.S. backing because in the end of the day, it is the U.S. that has a stronghold in Dominican Republic and foreign American investments that have a stronghold in the country.